My name is Ada, and I am 65 years old. As I sit here in my quiet living room, looking out at the garden my late husband Henry once tended with such care, I find myself thinking about choices and their consequences. 2 years ago, I made a decision that forever changed my family's future. It was not made in anger, though I had every right to be furious. It was made in clarity after watching my only son choose a birthday party over his father's funeral. Some decisions reveal who we truly are, and some choices echo through eternity. Before I share what happened, I would love to know where you are watching from. Please hit that like button and subscribe if this story resonates with you. Trust me, you will want to hear how this unfolds. Let me take you back to the beginning, when life felt complete and my family was everything I had ever dreamed of. I met Henry when we were both 23, studying at the University of Michigan. He was an engineering student with calloused hands and the gentlest smile I had ever seen. He pursued me with the patience of someone who understood that the best things in life were worth waiting for. We would spend hours walking around campus, talking about everything and nothing, sharing dreams that seemed impossibly bright. Our wedding day was small, but perfect. Henry's parents had passed when he was young, and my family was modest, but we did not need much. What mattered was the promise we made to each other under that simple arch of white roses. For 42 years, he kept that promise every single day. Henry became a civil engineer, specializing in bridge construction. He used to tell me that bridges were like relationships requiring strong foundations and regular maintenance to withstand the storms. Our marriage was his masterpiece in that regard. We weathered job losses, my mother's long illness, and the heartbreak of 3 miscarriages before our miracle finally arrived. Brandon came into our world when I was 31, after we had nearly given up hope of having children. Henry cried when he held our son for the first time, whispering promises about baseball games and fishing trips. Our little family settled into a comfortable rhythm in our modest 2-story home in Riverside, a quiet suburb where neighbors still knew each other's names and children played in the streets until the streetlights came on. Henry was the kind of father who never missed a school play or soccer game. He taught Brandon to throw a curveball in our backyard, showed him how to change oil in the garage, and took him fishing every Saturday morning at Miller's Lake. Those weekend mornings were sacred in our house. I would wake to the sound of their quiet laughter as they prepared their tackle boxes, and Henry would always kiss my forehead before they left, promising to bring home dinner. Brandon was a bright child, curious and kind, with Henry's gentle nature and my stubborn determination. He excelled in school, played varsity baseball, and had a close circle of friends. Family dinners were filled with his stories about classes and teammates, his plans for college, his dreams of becoming a lawyer, like his hero, Atticus Finch. Henry would lean back in his chair, pride shining in his eyes, and say, "That boy is going to change the world, Ada." Our traditions were simple but treasured. Thanksgiving meant Henry's famous turkey and my grandmother's stuffing recipe. Christmas mornings were spent in pajamas, opening gifts, slowly savoring each moment. Summer vacations took us to national parks, where Henry would point out the engineering marvels of bridges and dams, while Brandon collected rocks and pressed leaves in his nature journal. Those were golden years when our biggest worry was whether Brandon would remember to call when he got to college. Henry used to joke that our son was too good to be true, that surely the universe would demand some kind of payment for such happiness. I would laugh and tell him to stop tempting fate. If only I had known how prophetic those words would become. Everything changed the summer Brandon turned 27 and brought home Sophia. She was undeniably beautiful, with perfectly styled blonde hair and a smile that seemed calculated rather than genuine. She worked in marketing for a tech startup downtown, always impeccably dressed in designer clothing that cost more than Henry made in a month. From the moment she walked into our home, I felt a shift in the air, like the pressure drop before a storm. Brandon had called ahead, nervous, in a way I had never heard before. "Mom, I'm bringing someone special for dinner Sunday. Her name is Sophia, and I really, really like her." There was something in his voice, a breathless quality that made me uneasy. My son had dated before, brought home girls from college and work, but this felt different, more desperate. That first dinner was awkward, in ways I struggled to define. Sophia complimented everything with the kind of enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. She praised my pot roast effusively, then barely touched it. She admired our family photos while somehow managing to position herself between Brandon and the camera whenever Henry tried to take new ones. She asked all the right questions about our lives, but I noticed she never really listened to the answers. What disturbed me most was how Brandon behaved around her. My confident, articulate son became almost subservient, jumping up to refill her water glass, apologizing when she frowned at his stories, watching her face for approval before he laughed. When she mentioned being tired, he immediately suggested they leave cutting short what had always been our leisurely Sunday visits. In the weeks that followed, the changes in Brandon became more pronounced. Our weekly phone calls dwindled to hurried conversations where he seemed distracted. He missed Henry's birthday dinner because Sophia had bought tickets to a wine tasting. He skipped our annual 4th of July barbecue because she wanted to spend the weekend at her friend's lake house. Each absence felt like a small betrayal, not just to us, but to the family traditions he had always treasured. Henry tried to be understanding. "She's young," he would say, "and Brandon's in love. Remember how you barely had time for your parents when we were dating?" But I could see the hurt in his eyes when Brandon canceled plans at the last minute or rushed off the phone because Sophia was calling. The engagement announcement came 8 months later, delivered via a text message with a photo of Sophia's enormous diamond ring. No phone call, no family dinner, just a casual, "We're engaged," followed by heart emojis. Henry stared at his phone for a long moment before quietly saying, "I guess we're losing him." Wedding planning became a nightmare of demands and passive-aggressive comments. Sophia wanted everything perfect, which apparently meant expensive and exclusive. She criticized the church where Henry and I had married as too small and outdated. She suggested I might want to update my wardrobe for the photos. She changed the menu 3 times, the flowers twice, and somehow managed to schedule the ceremony during Brandon's annual fishing weekend with his father. When Henry gently mentioned the conflict, Brandon snapped at him. "Dad, I'm getting married. This is more important than fishing." It was the first time I had ever heard my son speak harshly to his father. Henry's face went pale, and he simply nodded. That night, I found him sitting on our back porch, staring at Brandon's old baseball glove that still hung in the garage. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in October. Henry had been feeling tired lately, attributing it to longer hours on his latest bridge project. When his cough persisted for 3 weeks, I finally dragged him to Dr. Martinez, our family physician for 20 years. The chest X-ray revealed shadows that led to more tests, biopsies, and finally, the devastating diagnosis, stage 4 lung cancer. Henry, had never smoked a day in his life. Dr. Martinez was gentle but honest. With aggressive treatment, we might buy 6 to 8 months. Without it, maybe 3. The words hit me like physical blows. My strong, dependable Henry, who had built bridges to last centuries, was crumbling from the inside out. I called Brandon immediately, my hands shaking as I dialed his number. "Brandon, honey, I need you to sit down. It's about Dad." The silence on the other end seemed to stretch forever before I found the courage to say the words. "He has lung cancer. It's advanced." Brandon's response was not what I expected. Instead of shock or immediate concern, there was a pause, followed by practical questions. "What stage? What are the doctors saying? How long?" His tone was almost clinical, as if he were gathering information for a case rather than processing the potential loss of his father. When I explained the prognosis, he simply said, "Okay, well, keep me updated," and hung up. Henry took the news with the same quiet dignity he brought to everything else. "I'm not afraid of dying, Ada. I'm afraid of leaving you alone." We held each other in that sterile doctor's office and made plans to fight as hard and as long as we could. The chemotherapy was brutal. Henry, who had always been stocky and strong, began to shrink before my eyes. His thick gray hair fell out in clumps, and his appetite disappeared entirely. I quit my part-time job at the library to care for him full-time, and we restructured our finances to manage the mounting medical bills. Our savings account, carefully built over decades for retirement adventures, began to dwindle rapidly. Through it all, Brandon remained conspicuously absent. He would call every 2 weeks or so, asking about treatment progress in the same tone he might use to inquire about a construction project's timeline. When I suggested he visit, he always had excuses. A big case was going to trial. Sophia needed him for wedding planning. Work was demanding overtime. The promises to visit soon became routine lies we all pretended to believe. Henry never complained about Brandon's absence, but I watched him check his phone constantly, hoping for calls that rarely came. When Brandon did call, Henry's face would light up and he would struggle to sit up straighter, as if his son might somehow sense his weakness through the phone. These conversations were always brief, and Henry would spend hours afterward replaying every word, analyzing Brandon's tone for hidden meanings. The loneliness was crushing. While Henry endured chemotherapy, I sat in hospital waiting rooms, surrounded by other families, watching adult children hold their parents' hands, bring homemade soup, and share memories. I made excuses for Brandon's absence, telling concerned friends that he was handling things in his own way. But inside, I felt abandoned by the child we had devoted our lives to raising. Our neighbor, Mrs. Patterson, brought casseroles twice a week. Henry's old construction crew visited regularly burly men with tattoos and gentle hearts who would sit quietly beside his bed, talking about fishing and football. Even Dr. Martinez made house calls during Henry's worst days, going far beyond professional duty. Everyone showed up except the one person Henry needed most. By April, Henry's condition had deteriorated significantly. The chemotherapy had stopped working, and Dr. Martinez gently suggested we focus on comfort rather than cure. Henry spent most days sleeping, waking only for medication and brief conversations. His breathing had become labored, and he had lost nearly 40 pounds. Still, whenever the phone rang, he would force his eyes open, hopefully, waiting to hear if it might be Brandon. I called my son with increasing desperation. "Brandon, You need to come home. Dad is failing rapidly." His responses became shorter and more evasive. "I'm trying to wrap up this case, Mom. Maybe next weekend." The weekends came and went without him. Then came the call I had been dreading. Dr. Martinez visited on a Wednesday evening and took me aside quietly. "Ada, I think you need to prepare yourself. Henry probably has days, not weeks." The finality of it hit me like a physical blow. I immediately called Brandon, my voice breaking, as I explained the urgency. "Brandon, honey, this is it. The doctor says Dad might not make it through the weekend. You need to come home now." For the first time in months, I heard real emotion in his voice. He promised to book the first flight out of Chicago to be home within 24 hours. Henry's face transformed when I told him Brandon was finally coming. "He's really coming, Ada. My boy is coming home." For 2 days, Henry rallied with an energy I had not seen in months. He wanted to shower and shave, to put on his favorite flannel shirt. He asked me to make his mother's chocolate chip cookies, Brandon's favorite since childhood. He sat up in his recliner, facing the door, waiting for the sound of a key in the lock. Every car that passed our house made him straighten up expectantly. Friday evening, less than 24 hours before Henry would pass away, my phone rang. I answered it eagerly, expecting to hear that Brandon had landed safely. Instead, I heard my son's voice, tight, with what sounded like frustration rather than grief. "Mom, I'm not going to be able to make it this weekend after all." The words hit me like ice water. "What do you mean, Brandon? Your father is dying." His explanation was devastating in its casual selfishness. Sophia's 30th birthday was Sunday, and she had been planning an elaborate party for months. All her friends would be there. Photographers had been hired. The venue was booked. "I can't disappoint her, Mom. She's been looking forward to this for so long." I found myself begging my own child. "Brandon, please. This is your father's last weekend. He's been waiting for you. He's holding on to say goodbye." But Brandon's response crushed what remained of my faith in the boy I had raised. "Mom, you're being dramatic. Dad will understand. Sophia's party is really important to her, and I can't let her down. Besides, Dad's tough. He'll pull through this like he always does." Henry had heard every word. From his chair across the room, I could see his face crumple as the hope that had sustained him for 2 days simply died. He closed his eyes and seemed to deflate physically, as if Brandon's words had punctured something vital inside him. When I hung up the phone, Henry whispered, "I failed as a father, didn't I, Ada?" I spent that night holding my dying husband as he wept quietly, not for himself, but for the son he felt he had somehow lost. "Where did I go wrong?" he asked repeatedly. "How did I raise a boy who would choose a party over his father's deathbed?" I had no answers, only tissues and useless reassurances that felt like lies even as I spoke them. Henry died the next morning, Saturday, while Brandon was probably choosing his outfit for Sophia's party. His last words were, "Tell Brandon I forgive him." He passed holding our wedding photo, his face peaceful, finally free from the pain of waiting for a son who never came. Planning Henry's funeral alone was a surreal experience. I moved through the motions mechanically, choosing a casket, writing an obituary, selecting flowers. The funeral director, a kind man named Mr. Stevens, kept asking about family members who might want to speak or help with arrangements. "What about your son?" he asked, gently. I could not bring myself to explain that my son was too busy to attend his own father's funeral. I called Brandon to inform him of his father's death. His reaction was muted, almost businesslike. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mom." The phrase sounded like something he might say to a client. When I mentioned the funeral arrangements, he immediately assured me he would fly home. "Of course I'll be there. I'll get the first flight out Monday morning." For 3 days, I allowed myself to hope that Brandon would somehow redeem himself, that faced with the finality of his father's death, he would remember the man who had taught him to throw a curveball and tie his shoes. I planned the service with him in mind, including the baseball poem Henry had always loved, and reserving a seat in the front pew where Brandon belonged. Sunday evening, less than 12 hours before the funeral, my phone rang again. This time, Brandon's excuse was even more absurd than the birthday party. Sophia had apparently gotten food poisoning from her elaborate birthday feast and was violently ill. "She needs me to take care of her mom. I can't leave her like this." The audacity of it left me speechless. My husband was dead, the funeral was in 12 hours, and my son was playing nursemaid to his wife's hangover. "Brandon," I said, my voice deadly calm, "this is your father's funeral. Your wife will survive without you for 48 hours. His response revealed just how far he had fallen from the boy I had raised. "Mom, you're strong. You can handle this. Sophia is really sick, and she needs me more than you do right now." The line went dead, leaving me alone with my grief and a rage so pure it felt cleansing. Monday morning dawned gray and cold, appropriate weather for burying the best man I had ever known. I dressed in my black suit, pinned Henry's favorite brooch to my lapel, and drove to the church where we had been married 4 decades earlier. The parking lot was fuller than I had expected, filled with pickup trucks from Henry's construction crews, sensible sedans from our neighborhood, and cars I did not recognize, belonging to people whose lives Henry had touched in ways I was only beginning to understand. The church was packed. Henry's work colleagues filled 3 entire pews, weathered men in suits they rarely wore, some openly weeping. Our neighbors came people who had known Henry as the man who plowed their driveways without being asked and helped carry groceries for elderly Mrs. Chen. Former baseball teammates of Brandon's attended with their parents, young men who remembered the countless Saturday mornings Henry had spent coaching their little league team. I sat in the front pew alone, acutely aware of the empty space beside me, where Brandon should have been. Throughout the service, people kept glancing at that empty spot, their confusion evident. During the receiving line afterward, the questions began. "Where's Brandon? Is he okay? Did something happen to him too?" I found myself making excuses, protecting my son, even as he broke my heart. He couldn't make it due to circumstances. Pastor Williams delivered a beautiful eulogy about Henry's dedication to family and community, his integrity and quiet strength. He spoke about the bridges Henry had built, both concrete and metaphorical, connecting people and communities across the state. As he talked about Henry's pride in his son, I felt the weight of Brandon's absence like a physical ache. The most devastating moment came when Henry's foreman, a gruff man named Tony, approached the podium to speak. He told a story about Henry carrying a photo of Brandon in his hard hat, showing it to anyone who would listen. "That man talked about his boy every single day," Tony said, his voice breaking. "He was so proud, always said Brandon was going to be something special. I know Henry's looking down right now, proud of the man Brandon became." I wanted to scream that Brandon had not become anything Henry would recognize, that the boy in those photographs had somehow been replaced by a stranger who chose parties over his father's deathbed. Instead, I sat silently accepting condolences from people who had shown more respect for my husband in death than his own son had shown in life. The house felt impossibly empty after the funeral. Friends and neighbors had filled it with casseroles and flowers, but once they left, the silence was deafening. I sat in Henry's recliner that night, surrounded by sympathy cards and his personal belongings, trying to process the magnitude of what had happened. My husband was gone and my son had chosen not to say goodbye. It was then that I remembered the will. Henry and I had updated it 5 years earlier when Brandon graduated law school. In our simple, middle-class way, we had been proud to leave him something substantial. Our house worth about $800,000 in the current market, plus nearly $300,000 in savings and retirement accounts. It was not a fortune, but it represented a lifetime of careful planning and sacrifice meant to give our son security and perhaps help with his own children someday. Sitting there in the dark, I realized that Brandon had already made his choice about what our family meant to him. The boy who had been too busy to say goodbye to his father did not deserve to benefit from a lifetime of that father's love and sacrifice. Henry had worked construction for 43 years, his body bearing the scars of labor that built bridges and buildings across 3 states. Every dollar we had saved came from his sweat and dedication, motivated by love for the son who could not spare 2 days to be with him at the end. The decision crystallized slowly, like ice forming on a winter pond. I would not act in anger or haste, but I would act with purpose. Brandon had shown me exactly who he had become, and I believed him. If he could choose a birthday party over his father's last words, he had forfeited any claim to being Henry's heir in any meaningful sense. The next morning, I called Mrs. Patricia Walsh, a family law attorney whose daughter had been in Brandon's graduating class. I explained the situation honestly, without embellishment or emotion, simply laying out the facts of Brandon's choices. Mrs. Walsh listened without judgment, then walked me through the legal process of changing my will. "You understand," she said gently. "This decision will likely end your relationship with your son permanently." I had already accepted that truth. The son I had raised would never have missed his father's funeral. The man who had taken his place was not someone I recognized or wanted in my life. We structured the new will carefully and legally. Brandon would inherit 10% of the estate, enough to show I had not forgotten him entirely, but not enough to reward his cruelty. The remaining 90% would go to the regional cancer center, where Henry had received treatment specifically designated for a fund to help families manage the devastating costs of care. If Brandon's choices had taught me anything, it was that family was not about blood alone, but about showing up when it mattered most. The paperwork took several weeks to complete. Throughout the process, I felt a strange sense of peace, as if Henry were guiding my hand. This was not revenge. It was accountability. Brandon was a successful lawyer, earning good money. He did not need our modest inheritance to survive. But families battling cancer needed every resource available, and Henry's money could actually save lives, rather than simply enabling more selfishness. I signed the final documents on a sunny Thursday morning in June, exactly 2 months after Henry's funeral. Walking out of Mrs. Walsh's office, I felt lighter than I had in years. Brandon continued his sporadic phone calls, never mentioning his absence from the funeral, chatting about work and Sophia's latest projects, as if nothing had happened. I did not tell him about the will. There would be time enough for that conversation later. I lived for 2 more years after Henry's death, quiet years, spent volunteering at the library and tending his garden. Brandon called monthly brief conversations that skimmed the surface of our lives. He never apologized for missing the funeral, never acknowledged the pain his absence had caused. I began to understand that in his mind, he had simply made practical choices based on his priorities. The fact that those priorities did not include his dying father was apparently irrelevant to him. My stroke came suddenly on a Tuesday evening in March. I was reading in Henry's chair when the world tilted sideways and the book fell from my numb fingers. Mrs. Patterson found me the next morning and called the ambulance, but by then it was too late. I spent 3 days in the hospital, unable to speak clearly, before a second stroke claimed me quietly in my sleep. Brandon flew home for my funeral, his first visit since before Henry's cancer diagnosis. He seemed genuinely grieved, which surprised me. Perhaps losing both parents finally penetrated whatever wall Sophia had built around his heart. The service was smaller than Henry's, but still well attended. I had made many friends during my volunteer work, and they came to pay their respects. After the burial, Brandon met with Mrs. Walsh for the reading of my will. He arrived confident, probably already planning how to spend his inheritance. Sophia accompanied him, dressed expensively, and checking her phone throughout the proceedings. They clearly expected this to be a formality, a simple transfer of assets to the only surviving child. Mrs. Walsh read the will exactly as I had written it. 10% of all assets to Brandon, 90% to the Henry and Ada Memorial Cancer Support Fund, established to help families facing the devastating costs of cancer treatment. I had also recorded a video message, played now for the first time, explaining my reasoning in my own words. In the recording, I appeared calm and rational, sitting in our living room with Henry's photograph visible on the table beside me. I explained Brandon's choices, simply and factually. His absence during Henry's illness, his decision to attend a birthday party, instead of saying goodbye to his dying father, his failure to attend the funeral. I was not angry in the video, just infinitely sad. I am not punishing Brandon out of spite, I said to the camera. I am simply acknowledging the choice he made about what kind of son he wanted to be. Henry and I worked our entire lives to build something meaningful, something that could help others. Brandon showed us that he values parties over family convenience, over commitment. This inheritance will now help families who understand what love and sacrifice actually mean. The silence in Mrs. Walsh's office after the video ended was profound. Sophia was the first to explode, demanding to know if the will could be contested, threatening lawsuits, accusing me posthumously of being vindictive and cruel. Brandon sat frozen, staring at the table where Mrs. Walsh had laid out the legal documents that transferred 90% of his expected inheritance to strangers. Mrs. Walsh calmly explained that the will was ironclad. I had been of sound mind. The video provided clear evidence of my reasoning, and multiple witnesses had attested to the document's validity. There were no grounds for a successful contest, and any legal challenge would likely cost more than the 10% Brandon was receiving. That night, Brandon sat alone in our empty house, surrounded by 43 years of memories. For the first time since Henry's diagnosis, he truly processed what his choices had cost him. Not just money, though the financial loss was significant, but the realization that his parents had died, believing he did not love them enough to sacrifice a single weekend for their sake. He found Henry's journal in the bedroom dresser entries, spanning the final months of his illness. Page after page documented a father's hope that his son would visit, would call, would remember the man who had taught him everything about being human. The final entry, written the day before Henry died, simply said, "I keep thinking Brandon will surprise me and show up. I have so much I want to tell him about being a good man. I hope someone teaches him what I could not." Sophia left Brandon within a week of learning about the inheritance. Their marriage, built on financial expectations and social status, could not survive the reality of a middle-class lawyer's salary. She moved out while he was at work, taking her expensive furniture and leaving only a note about reassessing her priorities. Brandon found himself truly alone for the first time in his adult life. The Cancer Foundation sent him updates about the fund established in his parents' names. Families across the state were receiving help with medical bills, transportation costs, and temporary housing during treatment. Children were able to stay with their sick parents instead of being separated by financial constraints. The money Henry had earned building bridges was now building bridges between families and hope. Brandon began volunteering at the Cancer Center on weekends, initially driven by guilt, but gradually finding genuine purpose in the work. He helped families navigate insurance paperwork, drove patients to treatments, and sat with people during chemotherapy sessions. Slowly, he began to understand what his father had tried to teach him about showing up for people who needed him. A year after my death, Brandon stood at our shared gravesite on the anniversary of Henry's passing. He had brought Henry's old baseball glove and a letter he had written but would never be able to send. In it, he apologized for the man he had become and promised to spend the rest of his life trying to become the son we had raised him to be. The memorial fund grew beyond anything Henry and I could have imagined. Donations poured in from people who had been touched by the story, from families who understood the importance of being present during life's most difficult moments. Brandon established an annual scholarship in our names for children who had lost parents to cancer, ensuring that our legacy would continue long after our modest inheritance was spent. He never remarried, dedicating himself instead to his work and his volunteer service. People at the Cancer Center came to know him as a quiet man who never missed a shift, who remembered patients' names and their children's birthdays, who understood the weight of being absent when presence was needed most. On quiet evenings, Brandon would sit in our old house, which he had kept rather than selling, reading Henry's journals and looking through photo albums from his childhood. The pictures showed a different person, a boy who had once been capable of unconditional love before he had learned to calculate the cost of every kindness. The final lesson came not from anger or punishment, but from understanding that some choices cannot be undone. The time Brandon did not spend with his dying father would never be recovered. The words he did not say, the hand he did not hold, the goodbye he did not give, these absences had become permanent fixtures in our family's story. But perhaps redemption is not about erasing our failures, but about learning to live differently because of them. Brandon learned to show up. He learned that love is not a feeling, but a practice, not words, but presence. He learned what Henry had always known, that bridges are built one beam at a time with patience and dedication, and the faith that connection is always possible. Family is not just about blood. It is about being there when it matters most, about choosing love over convenience, sacrifice over selfishness. Some choices echo through eternity, leaving ripples that touch lives we will never meet. Henry's legacy was not just the bridges he built over rivers, but the bridge he tried to build between himself and his son. Brandon's tragedy was not that he lost an inheritance, but that he discovered it too late. The Henry and Ada Memorial Cancer Support Fund continues to this day, helping families stay together during their darkest hours. Every family it helps is a testament to the truth that love multiplies when we give it away, that presence is the greatest gift we can offer each other, and that sometimes the most important bridges we build are the ones that span the distance between who we are and who we might become. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to make a difficult choice between family obligations and other commitments? How do you think you would have handled Brandon's situation? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and please take a moment to like this video if it touched your heart. Subscribe for more stories about family forgiveness and the choices that define us. Share this story with someone who might need to hear about the importance of being present for the people we love. Thank you for listening to my story, and may you always choose love when it matters most. Until next time, remember that every moment with our loved ones is a gift, and presence is the most precious present we can give.